The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of the people waiting their turn. William Harrington sat at the bench, reviewing the docket for the day. His robes, a symbol of authority, swayed as he leaned forward, scanning the papers before him. He'd presided over hundreds of cases like this one. A simple traffic violation, a minor infraction. Nothing that warranted much thought or attention. Just another ordinary day. Samantha Carter entered the room, a slight figure in her early 30s, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and dark jeans. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She seemed out of place in the sterile, formal environment of the courtroom. William couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable she appeared. The bailiff called her name, and she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she walked past the row of chairs, William's eyes followed her. For a moment, he thought he saw something familiar about her. The way she moved, the way she carried herself. When she stood before him, William glanced down at her case file. The details were straightforward. Samantha Carter had been cited for speeding in a school zone. It was a small violation, but one that still carried a fine. "Miss Carter," William began, his voice calm and firm. "You've been charged with speeding in a school zone. This is a serious matter, and the fine is set at $250. Do you have any explanation for this?" Samantha's face flushed as she stood there, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if unsure how to approach the situation. Finally, she sighed and said, "I was rushing to pick up my daughter from school. I lost track of time, Your Honor. I know it was wrong, but I was just trying to get there quickly. I'm a single mother. I don't mean to break the law." William's eyes softened for a moment as he studied her. She wasn't the first person to come before him with a sob story, but there was something in her voice, something that tugged at him. Maybe it was the sincerity or the quiet desperation in her words. Still, the law was the law. "While I understand your situation, Miss Carter," William said, his tone professional, "the law applies to everyone, no matter the circumstances. I will issue the fine as required." He gestured to the clerk to prepare the paperwork. As he did, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. It wasn't guilt. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. His fingers paused on the gavel. The moment stretched, and for a brief second, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, something that echoed a past he had long buried. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Without further hesitation, William made the call. Case closed. The courtroom emptied, and the usual bustle of the courthouse returned to its rhythm. William sat at his desk, sifting through papers from the day's cases, but his mind was elsewhere. The click of the door closing echoed in his office as the last person left, leaving him in the silence of his own thoughts. He stared at the stack of case files in front of him, but his mind kept returning to the brief moment with Samantha Carter. He couldn't shake it. The nagging feeling that something about her had triggered a memory he couldn't fully grasp. There was something familiar about the way she stood, the tilt of her head when she spoke, the softness in her eyes when she talked about her daughter. William's mind drifted to his childhood, to days spent in the sun, playing in the dirt, and running through the streets with his best friend, Samantha. The thought hit him like a wave. Samantha Carter was the same girl from his childhood, the one he had lost touch with when his family moved away. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, each memory rushing back to him. Samantha, with her infectious laughter, the way they used to climb trees together, and the summers they spent riding bikes around the neighborhood. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now, after seeing her in the courtroom, everything came flooding back. William rubbed his temples, trying to push the thoughts aside. How could it be? He hadn't seen her in more than 2 decades. The last time they spoke, he was leaving for high school, and their paths had diverged, as they often do. He hadn't kept in touch. Samantha's family had lived in a neighborhood that was very different from his, and over the years, they had simply drifted apart. He never imagined that years later, The girl he once shared everything with would appear before him as a defendant in his courtroom. The more he thought about it, the more questions filled his mind. What had happened to her since then? He wondered if she was still the same person he remembered, so full of energy and hope, or had life's challenges worn her down? And why hadn't he recognized her earlier? He prided himself on his ability to recall faces and names, but with Samantha, he had missed the connection completely. The gavel's echo from earlier in the day seemed to reverberate through his thoughts, mingling with the image of Samantha's face. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty courthouse hallway outside his office, feeling a strange sense of disquiet he couldn't explain. What if he had been too quick to judge? What if there was more to her story than he knew? The evening stretched on, but William couldn't focus on the mountain of work piling up before him. The words Samantha had said in court, her nervous explanation about her daughter, echoed in his mind. He found himself replaying their encounter over and over, searching for any clue he might have missed. His thoughts drifted back to their shared past, to a time when the world was simpler, and the days were filled with the kind of carefree laughter only children know. Growing up, William and Samantha had been inseparable. They lived a few blocks apart, their childhoods intertwined by an unspoken bond. Summers meant playing tag until the streetlights flickered on, riding bikes around the block, and trading secrets no one else could understand. The world hadn't yet been divided by differences in skin color or social status. Back then, William had never noticed the distance between their worlds. He was just a boy, and she was his best friend. But as the years passed, life began to pull them in different directions. William's family moved to a wealthier neighborhood, and the dynamics between them subtly shifted. The distance between their homes grew, both physically and emotionally, and without realizing it, they stopped seeing each other. High school came, then college, and soon, the girl who had once been his closest companion became a faded memory, tucked away somewhere in the back of his mind. Now, as an adult, William's life had turned into a well-ordered routine of work and responsibilities. He had become the person he'd once admired from afar, an authority figure, a judge. He spent his days enforcing the law, believing that fairness and justice were his guiding principles. But as he sat there, in the quiet of his office, a nagging feeling lingered. Why hadn't he thought of Samantha sooner? It bothered him more than he cared to admit. The realization that a person who had once been so significant to him had slipped through the cracks of his memory left him uneasy. Had their friendship truly meant so little? Or had life, with all its complexities, simply torn them apart without either of them realizing? His mind wandered to her face again, that same face he had seen in the courtroom. She looked so different now, mature, worn by the years, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. He knew it. The small traces of the girl he had known were still there, tucked behind the experiences that had shaped her into the woman standing before him today. William's hand hovered over his desk, and for a moment he wondered whether he could reach out, find her, and ask the questions that had been bubbling inside him. Was it too late to reconnect? Would she even want to? A sense of longing mixed with regret tightened in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had failed her. The next day, William couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He found himself standing in front of his office window, gazing out at the busy courthouse steps. People came and went, oblivious to the personal struggles and stories unfolding behind the doors. But for William, the sight of Samantha in his courtroom had left a mark, one he couldn't simply erase. It was as though a door to his past had been opened, and now he had to know what had happened to the girl he once knew. Determined to find answers, William did something he hadn't done in years. He called his mother. "Hey, Mom," he began, his voice sounding more hesitant than he intended. "Do you remember Samantha Carter? The girl I used to hang out with when we were kids?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could hear the soft clink of dishes being washed in the background before his mother replied. "Samantha Carter. Of course, I remember her. You two were inseparable. Why do you ask?" William felt a pang of nostalgia. The memories of their childhood came rushing back. Long days spent playing in the yard, making up games, and sharing the kind of innocent conversations that only best friends have. He hadn't thought of Samantha in years. The abruptness of her reappearance in his life left him feeling unmoored. I saw her yesterday in court," William said slowly, almost uncertain how to explain. "She was in front of me for a minor traffic violation, and I realized it was her." His mother's voice softened. "She was always such a sweet girl, but I know her family had a tough time after you moved away. They never seemed to have it easy. Her father passed away when she was still in school, and I think things got harder after that. She was a bright girl, but life hasn't been kind to her." William took a deep breath, feeling a twinge of guilt he hadn't expected. The more he heard about Samantha's life, the more he realized how different their paths had been. His family had moved to a new neighborhood, one with more opportunities, more resources. Samantha's family had stayed behind in the same difficult circumstances, struggling to make ends meet. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been more apparent. And yet, despite the years and the differences, a bond had once existed between them, a bond William could still feel, even now. "I had no idea," William murmured, the weight of his own privilege settling heavily on his shoulders. "Do you have any idea where she is now?" "I think she's still in town," his mother replied. "I heard she's raising a daughter on her own. Poor thing. I can't imagine how hard it must be for her." The conversation left William unsettled. Samantha had gone from a carefree girl he once knew to a mother struggling to balance life's burdens. The idea that she had fought so many battles without him even knowing gnawed at him. He knew he couldn't just leave things as they were. He needed to reconnect with her, to understand the life she had built and the struggles she faced. With a sense of resolve, William picked up the phone again. This time, he was calling not as a judge, but as a man searching for a friend he had lost long ago. The next afternoon, William sat in his car outside a small cafe, nervously tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. He had called Samantha the night before, after speaking with his mother, and to his surprise, she had agreed to meet. The conversation had been brief, guarded, but he could sense the hesitation in her voice. Samantha was cautious, as she had every right to be. After all, he was the same person who had just issued a fine on her in his courtroom. William had spent the hours leading up to their meeting rehearsing what he would say, but now that he was here, he found himself unsure of how to begin. He didn't want to approach her as a judge. He didn't want to stand over her, issuing judgments. He wanted to reconnect as someone who had once called her a friend, someone who remembered the carefree days of childhood and the promise of a bond that had long since faded. When Samantha arrived, she looked exactly as he remembered her, yet entirely different. Her face was marked by years of hardship, the sharp lines around her eyes a testament to the challenges she had faced. She wore simple clothes, a faded denim jacket over a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She hadn't changed much, except that the carefree girl he had known now carried the weight of life's struggles on her shoulders. Samantha spotted William immediately. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to his table, her expression a mix of wariness and curiosity. "Judge Harrington," she said, her tone polite but distant. She took a seat across from him without waiting for him to stand. "Samantha," he replied, offering a faint smile. He had no idea how to bridge the gap that had widened between them over the years. I'm glad you agreed to meet with me." Samantha didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to measure his sincerity. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. "Why now?" she asked bluntly. "Why reach out after all these years? After everything?" Her words stung, but William didn't flinch. He knew she was justified in her skepticism. He could see the walls she had built around herself, the protective armor forged from years of disappointment. William began, then paused. He hadn't prepared for this. "I don't know. I had no idea what had happened to you. And when I saw you in court yesterday, it hit me. You were my best friend, Samantha. I never thought I'd see you again, let alone in a courtroom. I felt like I had to at least try to explain myself." Samantha's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but the mask she wore quickly returned. "Explain yourself," she repeated, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "You find me, William. You gave me a ticket like I was just another case on your docket. Like we never mattered." The words hung in the air between them, and William's chest tightened. He had never considered the impact his position might have on people who once knew him, people like Samantha. It was like seeing her for the first time all over again. The girl he remembered was still there, but life had shaped her in ways he hadn't understood. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what to say to make it right." Samantha studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for any trace of the boy she had once known. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter this time. "I'm not sure you can make it right, William," she said, "but I'm listening." The silence between them lingered for a moment, thick with unspoken words. William could feel the weight of Samantha's gaze, steady and probing, as she watched him struggle to find the right words. He had spent so many years hiding behind his professional mask, judging others from a distance, that he hadn't realized how distant he had become from the people he once cared about. Now, sitting across from Samantha, he saw that the chasm between them wasn't just one of time. It was one of understanding. Samantha leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed in front of her. "You've got a lot of nerve, you know that," she said, her voice edged with frustration. "You're a judge now. You sit up there, passing judgment on people's lives, while you probably don't even think about where they're coming from." William felt the sting of her words, but he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. She was right. He had spent his entire career presiding over people's fates without truly understanding the complexities of their lives. To him, every case was a series of facts and rules to follow, a system that needed to function properly. But Samantha's words made him realize that the people in front of him were more than just cases. They were individuals with histories, with struggles, with pain. "I've had the privilege of a life with fewer obstacles," William admitted quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But I never really understood how different things could be for someone like you. I took my opportunities for granted." Samantha didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out the cafe window, her eyes distant as though replaying her own memories. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but there was a heaviness to it. "After you left, everything changed for me," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "I stayed in that neighborhood, but things weren't the same. My dad passed away when I was in high school. My mom worked long hours just to keep food on the table, and I had to grow up fast. There was no one to help me figure things out. I worked all through college, but it wasn't easy. I did what I had to do to get by." William's heart sank as he listened. He had known about her father's passing from his mother, but hearing Samantha speak about it so directly, so matter-of-factly, made him realize how much he had missed. He hadn't known the struggle she'd faced. The girl who had once been his partner in mischief, the one who could make him laugh even on the toughest days, had fought alone. And he hadn't even known. "I'm sorry, Samantha," he said quietly, his words feeling woefully inadequate. "I had no idea. I never stopped to think about what it must have been like for you." She met his gaze again, her eyes searching his face. "You wouldn't have, would you? You were off living your life, and I was just trying to survive mine. You made it. I didn't." William swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't intended to ignore her, that he hadn't meant to distance himself, but he knew that wasn't enough. He couldn't undo the years of silence, the years when he hadn't bothered to look beyond his own life to see hers. "I can't change the past," he said finally, his voice full of regret. "But I want to understand your story now. I want to hear what it's been like, if you'll let me." For the first time during their conversation, Samantha seemed to soften. She looked at him, her eyes a mixture of wariness and cautious hope. "It's not that simple, William," she said. "You can't just walk back into my life and expect everything to be okay. I've built a life without you, without anyone. I can't just forget that." William nodded, his heart heavy with the realization that there were no quick fixes, no easy apologies. But in her words, he also sensed a willingness to listen, to at least begin the painful process of rebuilding what had been lost. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said quietly. "But if you'll allow me, I want to be here. To learn from you, to make things right in whatever way I can." Samantha studied him for a moment longer before she sighed. A tired, almost resigned sound. "I don't know if things can ever be right, William," she said. "But maybe we can start by understanding each other again." The next few weeks felt like a slow unraveling for William. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Samantha. It had been more raw than anything he'd ever experienced in his courtroom. He'd always thought of himself as someone who understood people. He prided himself on being fair, on upholding the law with impartiality. But Samantha had opened his eyes to a different truth. The law didn't always account for the complexities of life, the struggles that people like her faced every day. Samantha had agreed to meet with him again, though her words still echoed in his mind. "You can't just walk back into my life." She was right. He had a long way to go before he could truly make amends, if that was even possible. But he was willing to try. The weight of the regret he felt now, seeing the gap between the man he was and the friend he once was more than he could bear if he didn't take the first step toward change. William began to reach out in small ways. He wasn't trying to make up for the years they'd lost, but he knew that the only way to build any trust again was through patience. He sent her a simple message one afternoon, apologizing again and asking if they could sit down over coffee, not to talk about the past, but just to talk about life, about the things they'd missed. To his surprise, Samantha agreed. She didn't act as if everything had changed, but there was a sense of cautious curiosity in her responses. They'd met at a small diner in town, a place neither of them had visited in years. Samantha sat across from him, the same wariness in her eyes, but this time there was a gentleness in her demeanor too. She was a mother now, carrying the weight of that responsibility with grace. The laughter that had once been so easy between them wasn't there yet, but the conversation flowed more easily than he expected. She spoke about her daughter, about how she had learned to juggle work, parenting, and her own dreams. The exhaustion was evident in her voice, but there was also a quiet pride that shone through when she spoke of her little girl. William found himself listening in a way he hadn't before. Every word, every story she shared felt like a small bridge being built between them. He asked questions he hadn't thought to ask in the past, about her struggles, her victories, her dreams for the future. He wanted to understand, to know the woman she had become, not the girl he had known so long ago. As the conversation went on, Samantha's walls seemed to lower, just a little. She was still cautious, still guarded, but there was a hint of the old Samantha, the girl he had once known, peeking through. When their coffee cups were empty and the meal finished, she didn't rush to leave. Instead, she sat for a moment, her fingers tapping gently on the side of her cup. "Maybe we can keep talking," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "Maybe we can start figuring out what comes next." William's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an apology, nor an outright forgiveness, but it was a sign that, despite everything, they could rebuild something between them, a connection, however fragile. And maybe, just maybe, that connection could help him understand the depth of her story in a way that no fine or courtroom ever could. The days that followed their conversation at the diner felt different to William. There was a sense of renewal in the air, something unspoken, but tangible. Rebuilding a connection with Samantha wasn't going to happen overnight, and William knew that. Yet the simple fact that she had agreed to meet again, that she was willing to take small steps toward understanding, meant more to him than he could put into words. He had spent so many years living in a bubble of privilege and status, never fully seeing the lives of those around him. But now, with Samantha, he was learning what it meant to really listen, to hear not just the words, but the story behind them. Over the next few weeks, their meetings continued. They didn't focus on the past. There were still too many painful memories, too much time that couldn't be regained. Instead, they spoke about the present. Samantha shared the challenges of raising her daughter alone, the small joys she found in the simple moments, and the dreams she still held for herself despite the obstacles life had thrown her way. William, in turn, talked about the pressures of his job, the expectations that weighed on him daily, and the loneliness that sometimes came with his role as a judge. Slowly, he began to see her not as the girl he had known, but as a woman who had lived a life filled with resilience and strength. One afternoon, as they sat in a park watching the sun dip below the horizon, Samantha looked at William, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You know, I never thought I'd be sitting here with you again," she said quietly, her voice thoughtful. "Not after everything. But I think I'm starting to understand that people change. And maybe we can both learn from what happened." William nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't help but feel grateful for this moment, for the second chance to rebuild something that had been lost. "I never imagined we'd be here either," he replied. "But I'm glad we are. And I know I can't change the past, but I want to make sure I do better from here on out. Not just for you, but for everyone I come across." Samantha's eyes softened as she watched him. "I think that's all anyone can really do. Try to do better. And for what it's worth, I believe you." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was enough. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they could heal, not just as old friends, but as two people who had learned the true value of understanding and empathy. Samantha had faced hardship without asking for help, and William had been blind to the struggles of the people around him. But in this moment, they were equals, both learning from each other. As they walked away from the park that evening, side by side, William couldn't help but feel that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. There were many steps ahead, many conversations left to be had, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. A judge, yes, but more importantly, a man, reconnecting with the past and striving to make things right, one step at a time.